Hello, I'm Tony Coleman. I'm a Director of Low Carbon Australia, and today I'm going to be talking about that organisation. Low Carbon Australia was created by the Australian Government about 3 years ago and given $100 million, with the prime objective being to catalyse private sector investment in energy efficiency by co-investing with the private sector in energy efficiency projects. The organisation's now matured to the point where most of the money has now been invested, and I'm going to talk further today about some of the lessons we've learned from that process, some of the projects we've invested in, and what we think the potential is for future growth in this area. Some of you in this room might be wondering what is Low Carbon Australia? It's a much smaller organisation than the last two you've just heard from, that's for sure. We employ all of 28 people. But it is owned by the Australian Government, and it was set up in late 2009, ironically about a week after the Copenhagen conference. And it was essentially given $100 million by the Australian Government and told to go away and invest that money, in essence, and the emphasis was in invest, not grant it or give it away. So the idea is we actually keep the assets for the long term. But in such a way that we achieve energy efficiency. That was the main goal, and in the way of doing that to reduce carbon emissions. Now, in many ways, it could be viewed, low carbon could be viewed, it wasn't intended as this at the time, but having been in operation now for a little over 3 years, some could see it as being the pilot program for the recently announced and indeed setting up now Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which has nominally at least been given eventually up to $10 billion, which is a hell of a lot more than $100 million. That's over a fairly extended time frame, but nevertheless with not terribly dissimilar objectives, although the structure in which the way the two organisations have been set up is a little different. And the intention is, indeed, over the next couple of months, for Low Carbon Australia to be rolled into the CEFC and brought under the same management team. So it's a very good time to reflect on what has low carbon done and what has it achieved. So essentially, I'll be taking you through that in this talk. Also talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned. It's what we think the growth opportunities are. And I'll take you through 5 of the case studies, very briefly, of things we've invested in and why. And I'll also talk very briefly about the carbon neutral program, which is the second program we also run on behalf of the federal government, where quite a large number of organisations have effectively signed up to deliver either carbon neutral products or indeed a carbon neutral organisation. And I know, as Emma mentioned, that's one of Westpac's objectives, and they have actually formally notified Low Carbon quite recently that that is one of their objectives, and they will go through the same process as the others that I'll talk about shortly in that area. It's quite interesting actually, there is, assuming Westpac does actually qualify, which I'm sure they will, there is actually only one of the 4 major trading banks left after that that is not a member of that program, but we'll come back to that later. So, what were the key objectives of low carbon? Cost-effective carbon savings, private sector funding leverage, which essentially means we didn't invest anything unless the private sector co-invested with us in the project. We had to achieve things that were additional to business as usual. This was part of our formal mandate, which was very explicitly documented for us by the government. And the whole idea essentially was to catalyse future carbon and energy savings. And the 2 main programs, the energy efficiency program, which is the one which is essentially all about investing the money we were given, and the other, with the carbon neutral program, which is running the voluntary carbon scheme. So, our investment approach has essentially been to try and find the gaps where people weren't already investing to achieve the ends consistent with what we were being asked to do. And we certainly worked out pretty quickly that we needed a lot of partnerships, because clearly we were an organisation, was never going to be a large organisation, we were never going to have a big marketing team going out there trying to sell deals. So we entered into a series of partnerships with other organisations where our objectives and theirs were largely aligned, both philosophically and commercially. And some of those organisations, the ones listed down the bottom there, not all of them by any means, but certainly Origin, NAB and Macquarie Bank were amongst them. So they effectively became, in some ways, our marketing arm, saving us an awful lot of time and trouble. Having said that, obviously we also responded to direct interaction with a number of businesses and did deal direct with quite a few, as it turned out, particularly interestingly local government bodies, but we'll come back to that later. Part of our operating principle is to essentially charge as much as the market will bear, but sometimes that means, although we obviously do need to make a profit, at least to pay enough to make ourselves financially sustainable, the way in which we advance funding does not necessarily exactly match what private sector lenders would provide. So in other words, when we provide money, there may be a few concessional features. Sometimes it's in the term where, particularly the banks will generally not go much beyond 5 years for some of this stuff. We'll do 7 or 10. We might be a little bit more lenient with our security requirements. Most of the banks will stop at about 60 or 70%. We can look at a little bit more than that, particularly for what might be loosely described second mortgage type positions in certain projects. And then, of course, obviously we can also, if we wish, adopt slightly concessional interest rates, although we've tended not to use that lever very often. In the process, we've actually created some quite new forms of finance, or worked with parties to do that, particularly environmental upgrade agreements, known there as EUAs, and I'll talk later about exactly what they are in very briefly, but effectively creating a new market, which is actually required new government legislation which has been passed in Victoria and New South Wales, and which then has to be adopted at a local government level in order to make it work. But it is beginning to be quite effective. On-bill finance was another one which was quite innovative, organised through Origin, where essentially both ourselves and Origin provide funds for energy efficiency projects for Origin's customers. All Origin's customers actually see is a payment which effectively comes through their normal energy bill. They don't actually have to worry about how that's actually been financed. The money is provided and they get guarantees that their energy bills won't rise. But what's actually going on, of course, is that the energy savings are paying back our finance behind the scenes. Nevertheless, it's been quite effective for small, medium enterprises. We do deal very much in established technologies. We're not like ARENA looking at new technologies. We are working with proven technologies, but quite a wide range of them, and quite a broad scale of projects involved, as you'll see. So, what were some of our key objectives? Well, co-investing with the private sector, we've certainly managed that. Catalysing cost-effective carbon reduction, we would certainly claim to have affected that. We had to look after our own long-term financial stability, sustainability, and I think the very fact that the CEFC was very keen to take us over says something about the fact that we managed to do that all right. And we basically had to develop something worthwhile that was complementary to the Australian government's overall climate change policy as that unfolded over the last 3.5 years. So if we look at the actual numbers backing up those claims, we were actually required to contract a minimum of $67 million, that is in actual committed investments, before 30th of June this year. Actually, we will reach 86 million in that figure. We know that now. We were expected to get at least $1 from the private sector for every dollar we invested. We actually managed to get $2.60 for every dollar we invested from the private sector. So in total, instead of achieving $135 million worth of invested projects, we've actually achieved just over $300 million worth of invested projects. And the interesting one is the next one. We were given a target quite explicitly in our key performance indicators when we were set up that we had to be able to demonstrate quite rigorously, and we had to actually build the methodology to do this, that when we invested in something, the cost of the carbon abatement achieved was less than $23 a tonne, which of course is a figure that most of you would recognise from another place.
The actual number that we have achieved on that $300 million worth of invested projects is negative. That's not a misprint. It's the revenues from those projects are actually higher than the costs. So we've actually got a negative number there. It's just a little bit below zero, but it's nowhere near $23 a tonne, which obviously tells you a lot about the projects. And the actual carbon abatement that has been achieved, about 330,000 tonnes per annum, which over the lifetime of these projects is about 3.7 million tonnes. That's obviously not huge, but it's a worthwhile contribution, particularly when its cost is pretty much bugger all in real terms. So that actually demonstrates the scale of what is potentially available to be done out there. And I emphasise the 330,000 per tonne does not include, importantly, the carbon neutral program abatement, which, as you'll see a bit later, is actually about 3 times that figure, and has also been achieved at very low cost. So in total, about 1.3 million tonnes per annum from the 2 activities that low carbon has been promoting. So what are some of the lessons? Well, the first lesson is that there are a lot of barriers out there to getting these projects done. And indeed, the first 18 months of low carbon's life, if I look back on it now, from the point of view of the board, was actually a bit frustrating. It took a long time to get anywhere, going out there, selling the message, educating the market. But what we then found was both water on the stone, but also obviously the carbon tax rolled around, which certainly focused people's minds much more than previously on that issue in the business sense. But also, of course, increasing electricity costs did also focus a lot of minds, simply because a large part of some of the projects we've done really do reduce energy costs because they're using energy much more efficiently. And of course that means much lower costs of generally electricity, but also in some cases gas and water supply. So I won't go through all of the other issues identified on that slide, but certainly I, for one, when I first went into this, thought, oh, I'm not sure these barriers are really that much barriers. Let me assure you they really are. And one of the really interesting effects is what we've found is the demonstration effect. That is, when one of these projects of a particular type finally gets up and it's done, and all the competitors of that company in that segment of the market realise that it's been done, it generates an enormous amount of interest from the second, third, fourth companies in that market, wanting to know what was done, why was it done, and can we do it too? And that demonstration effect alone is a really serious issue. Once you get one party to do a deal and demonstrate that it can be done and that they're going to save money by doing it, the effect that ripples through is really quite remarkable. And we've only actually scratched the surface on that respect, because in many cases, a lot of the deals we've done are often only the first or the second of their type in the market. So we've actually built quite a long pipeline, I think, now for the CEFC to be able to take advantage of, but I'll come back to that later. I won't dwell on this slide unnecessarily, but essentially there are a lot of... it's not just a case of build it and everyone will come. You really do need to educate the market along the way, and that's actually been a significant part of what we've actually had to do in order to get some of these transactions up. Some of the key success factors is recognising there is no one-size-fits-all. Probably every deal we've done has got a few different characteristics. And one of the really interesting things we've found is that in many organisations, the people responsible for the engineering, the product, and actually making things happen, if I can put it that way, are often remarkably disconnected from the finance arm. And very often, even just getting those two internally to talk to each other, and organisations of all sizes, often things that we found ourselves promoting, was actually quite difficult to do. And you'd often say, you know, get a project ready to go on the engineering side of an organisation, but they couldn't convince the finance people in the same organisation that this was a really good idea. And vice versa, sometimes we had the finance people saying, oh, this looks like a really attractive finance package, but you couldn't push the engineering people to do what they wanted to do because it wasn't in line with whatever their strategic plan was. So actually getting across the silos inside organisations and developing techniques to do that, we found was actually a critical success factor when we realised after a while what was going on. So where are some of the growth opportunities going forward? Certainly the whole biogas area, where essentially one can take methane from processes and turn it into electricity to drive the energy requirements of a particular production facility. There's plenty of potential there still. Food processing and manufacturing, electricity pressures once again there. Some of these areas we haven't necessarily got widely into yet, but certainly dairy farming and piggeries in particular are in that category. Solar PV, it's been mentioned earlier about the very rapid drop in costs of solar PV. When we started 3 years ago, there was no way that a solar PV project was going to get onto our radar screen. It just didn't have a hope that, financially. In the last couple of months, we've actually approved 2, both in remote locations, but both on the basis that, in essence, they were the cheapest alternative in those locations with the current cost levels. The rate at which solar PV is becoming cost competitive now is continuing, I think, to really spread, and I think is probably one of the unrecognised features of how the market is going to change. The whole issue around distributed generation and peaking plants and electricity supplied through the grid versus electricity not coming through the grid is definitely a big area of future scope, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute with one of our example projects. I suspect that this may sound a little bit radical at this stage, but I wouldn't be that surprised if 10 years from now we're talking about stranded assets in the grid. That is, there'll be so much electricity cost-effectively generated that doesn't need the grid, that the grid will be really struggling to justify its existence. Now, that's just a personal view, but the whole thinking of the electricity industry and the use of the grid is about to come in for a really major change, I think. And finally, one of the other interesting areas we operated in was the whole area where often there were split incentives between in buildings between a lessee and a landlord, so that no one really had the incentive to make the energy-saving investment, and we had to break through those. The other classic, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, in that area is street lighting and local government councils, which had huge split incentive problems. But we have finally managed to get one of those deals up now, and hopefully it will be the first of its kind, which will really begin to move that area down the track. So the 5 I'm going to talk about, just to give you a flavour for some of the things we've done, are these 5, which I'll just go through fairly quickly. This is actually the largest abattoir in Australia in southeast Queensland, and indeed they actually signed this only 2 days ago, the final deal. Processes about almost 1,700 head of cattle a day. And basically it's a roughly $9 million project to build a new anaerobic lagoon, which basically, put simply, captures the methane that comes off the abattoir offal and process, and uses that methane is then basically used to fire up a boiler which generates power. The power is used to run the whole of the plant. Saves about 1.1 million per annum in the energy costs and about 45,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum in that plant alone. And I should recognise here that, of course, the project was made possible in part by the fact that they also applied for a clean technology grant from the federal government under the Clean Technology Grant Program, which, when combined with 50% of the cost from us as basically a loan, was able to make the project stack up. Nevertheless, you'd be amazed as this one has unfolded, a whole series of abattoirs are now very interested in doing similar deals. This one is quite an interesting one. Fraser's in Broadway, literally about 1 kilometre that way, down between Central Railway Station and right here. There is a whole new property development project going on the old Kent Brewery site. The total project there is worth about $2 billion. They're building about 7 buildings with about 2,100 residential apartments, a shopping centre and a few other mixed-use uses. And in essence, what we have done there, in conjunction with the ANZ Bank, is put in place what's known as an environmental upgrade agreement, which will finance a tri-generation plant worth about $26 million. Now that tri-generation plant, for those of you not particularly familiar with tri-generation, first of all, this is the first tri-generation plant in Sydney, and we're fairly confident there's going to be quite a few more of them. It was actively encouraged by the Sydney City Council, whose approval to do it via an EUA was critical. Basically put, if you take conventional power, coal or gas-fired, put it through the grid, the actual the mechanical efficiency of that process, you get about 35% efficiency out of it in terms of usable power at the end of the grid from what was put in terms of calorific value. Tri-generation, which does not use the grid at all, basically is a gas-fired unit, but it's effectively about 85% efficient. So there's a massive difference in the cost economics between what you can get out of tri-generation in energy output and what you get out of traditional grid-supplied power. And the reason is essentially that a tri-generation unit not only gives you the power to run the area that you're talking about, it also gives you hot water, it also gives you cold water, and the combination of those allows you to drive the air conditioning in the buildings as well. So you get a very large saving. In this case, it's expected that both power and hot water will be supplied straight across the road under Broadway to the University of Technology buildings in due course, which will give them further savings as well. So that's a good example of the sorts of things that can be done. And there are a lot of other potentials for this, particularly in major cities, particularly where you have facilities like hotels that use a lot of hot water sitting nearby big office blocks that basically need some power. This is very likely to be the forerunner of quite a number of these sorts of transactions. Warrnambool City Council, this is our first street lighting upgrade project. Just under $1 million, this one, to replace 2,200 residential street lights. This is quite an interesting one, 68% reduction in energy use for Warrnambool Council as a result of that. That's a pretty massive figure. You know, if somebody said to you, well, we've got a project that allows you to save more than 2/3 of your power bill, you'd probably start getting interested. Without going into the details, this whole area is quite fraught because a lot of councils don't own their own street lights, and very often the people who own the street lights have subcontracted the maintenance of that on a long-term basis to a third party. So you've actually got to manage 3 different parties to get a project like this up. But it also makes a meaningful contribution to reduction of emissions for local councils. As you see there, depending obviously on the local government area, anywhere between, say, 1/3 and 2/3 of their emissions will generally be from street lighting. There's at least another 2 projects like that one fairly well advanced, which we would expect that probably the CEFC will ultimately get done. Assuming, of course, and I should say this, that the CEFC survives, because as I'm sure many of you would know, it's, how can I put it, it's not part of the policy of the current opposition, federal opposition, so there is a chance that the CEFC may not survive beyond September. However, we'll leave that problem to another day. Another one of the projects that's just worth talking about, this is a slightly unusual one, known as Nova Power. Basically $11 million to build a gas peaking plant in the Latrobe Valley in Victoria that generates 10 megawatts of electricity. The reason this works economically is quite interesting. It's in a very specific and particular location, which basically there is a problem with the grid, which could be called a constriction or in the grid, so that we're very close to the point where the grid would have to be extended at considerable capital cost if this plant was not built. So what this essentially does, it basically allows the economics of the transaction basically work because of the avoided cost of not having to extend the grid for about another 15 years in this location, because this will sit there and generate power just for this area where the grid has basically reached its capacity. and because of the growth of the area, more power will be needed. The only way to get it there is either build a plant like this or extend the grid. This is a much cheaper way of just meeting the peaking requirement for quite a few years into the future, rather than making the capital investment to extend the grid. And so that is also basically a transaction that's just been completed in the last couple of months. And the final example is another abattoir, but this time it's an example of refrigeration. And refrigeration is very much an issue for a lot of the food processing industries. A lot of the fresh fruit that gets picked has to be refrigerated in many parts of Australia. Obviously also in many other areas revolving around food preparation generally, or manufacture. This project simply works by putting in much more efficient and energy efficient refrigeration into the abattoir, and it gets its payback simply by the energy savings, because the refrigeration unit installed is so much more efficient than the old one. Put simply, that one is about $845,000 worth of new refrigeration. Payback is in the order of 4 years. So that's just another example. That one happens to be an abattoir, but the point I'm really making is refrigeration is actually a major source of emissions and a major source of energy costs for a lot of businesses. This sort of thing has quite a lot of potential, and we've done several transactions like that one. Just very briefly at the end, I can't really leave without talking about the carbon neutral program. That slide basically just has a number of the logos of all of the participants in the program. These are the people who come to Low Carbon Australia to be authorised to use the carbon neutral logo that is provided under licence by the Australian government. The interesting thing about this is that all those people pay fees in order to get that done. It's not a free service. And this is totally voluntary. So this is basically supporting voluntary CO2 abatement efforts by those organisations. And you can see there's some pretty well-known names there. The other interesting thing about this is that about 3 years ago, when we took over the old greenhouse friendly program, for those of you who may remember that, which was run by the government, there were 16 participants. From memory, about 10 of those participants continued and about 6 of them dropped off. The old greenhouse friendly program, they didn't have to pay, so we've got in a situation where we took the program over. First thing we said to all the participants was, by the way, you now have to pay for this. And the fees are not huge, but they're not immaterial. And here we are 3 years later. The program, as you can see, is an awful lot more than 16 participants. It's worth just mentioning that during that time, probably the 2 or 3, well, certainly the ones that were attracted to the program who are new during that time, in the time we've been running it, the ANZ Bank, now carbon neutral, NAB, now carbon neutral, Dexus, major property group, PricewaterhouseCoopers, well-known accounting firm, Crown Casino. Now, Qantas and Virgin are there, but theirs are product-specific. They're not whole carbon neutral, but the other ones I've just mentioned are. So you can see that there's quite a lot of traction being generated within businesses that really do want to get on top of this issue in much the same way as Emma was explaining earlier with Westpac. And I mentioned, of course, Westpac have very recently also effectively joined this program, along with a number of others who are still in the pipeline. That program has generated over $1 million per annum of CO2 abatement, quite worthwhile. And the really interesting thing again about that is the total cost to the Australian government, at least, of that program. Obviously there are some other costs in the companies themselves, is all of 33 cents per CO2 tonne abated. That's 33 cents, not $33. So once again, from the point of view of the government, this is a very efficient, cost-efficient program. So that essentially, I think, wraps up a bit of an update on low carbon. And I hope you found that interesting at an interesting time in that organisation's life. So thank you very much.